Well, that's actually a great segue because my very next question is, how'd you find out about the unit? And I want to preface that when I interview guys who got into Delta in the 90s and maybe stayed through like 2009, 2010, a lot of them make the comment like, we didn't even know the thing existed. Like, we weren't aware until someone told us. We didn't know when we joined the military. Were you aware of what the unit was and what they did? I assume you must have been because you were deploying as a Green Beret in a time of war.
Yeah, but I never saw those guys. They were still mythical figures, overseas that you never worked with, you never saw. Um, the the only time I really even knew that it existed is because the Q course happens on Bragg, and at the end of this road is supposedly where the unit's at, and at some point, probably every Q course student drives down that road just to see the building at the end of that road. So I knew it existed because of being on Bragg, but oddly enough, I knew it existed more because Eric Haney wrote a book called Inside Delta Force
Right.
while I was in the Q course, and I read every special operations book I could get a hold of while I was in the Q course, basically from Vietnam to more current era. And so as soon as that thing came out, I read it in like 30 hours. So I was well aware of the unit thanks to that book.
And for our viewers who might not know, that book by Eric Haney was the inspiration of the old CBS TV show, The Unit, in like the mid 2000s.
Right. Yeah. And it was a great book. If like I said, I remember reading it in the Q course. And so at the time, I wasn't worried about going to the unit. I was just going to be happy to be a Green Beret. So it wasn't, till years later that I got to selection, but I remembered those stories of selection from his book that were, and that's what most people are mad at him about is he talked about selection, and that's something we just don't talk about.
Right. No, I've heard, well, there's plenty of articles online about how that drove a wedge between him and a lot of other people, which we'll have a question about that later in the interview, kind of on a very similar topic. When you finally get there, you've passed selection, you've done all the stuff you got to do to go in. One of the things I'm curious about, is it better to be really smart if you want to make the unit, or is it better to be a freak of nature athlete? Do you need a blend? Like if a young man's watching this right now, he's like, I want to do what Brent Tucker did. Better to be smart, better to be tough. What?
That's a good question, because to be honest with you, I mean, the cliche answer is both, and that is an actual answer, as cliche as it is. But you won't see a lot of guys that aren't very smart, make it to the unit. But I've seen guys that they were just smart enough, but man, were they strong, and they're just gonna power their way through everything. And I would argue we need those guys, but that's definitely not the bulk of our force. And most guys really are both. Like the smartest guys I've ever worked with are over at the unit.
And how long after you get through all the training, the selection, OTC, all that stuff, was it before you then actually deployed as a member, as an operator of Delta?
It was just a couple months. I went right into a pre-deployment and right into a deployment. Yeah, of course, at that time, and and to take a step back, one of the reasons I went there is because I wanted to keep deploying. 20th group, be a National Guard group, at the end of the day, deployed, if you wanted to, deployed as much as anyone else. I mean, as I could just raise my hand and go overseas, which is what I did a lot. But Iraq had gone away, Afghanistan, the writing on the wall on Afghanistan. At the time, I didn't think Afghanistan was going away, but combat operations in Afghanistan were getting harder and harder and harder to get out the gate. And so, the two reasons I went was I wasn't done going to war. I wanted to, keep deploying. And two, I didn't want to retire, thinking, what if,
Right.
And I tell people all the time, I wasn't the best guy on my ODA. You know, there were probably two guys, if you asked me, that I thought, you know, if you asked me who was the best guys on my ODA, I'd probably put two guys ahead of me, and that's the truth. But they didn't go to selection for whatever reason, and maybe they would have made it, maybe they wouldn't have. You know, the selection's a crazy process. I've seen guys that I knew in SF, their selection, that I knew were better than me, that didn't make it to the end. And for the life of me, I don't know why they didn't, and I don't know why I did. And sometimes that's just, that's just how, life deals you cards.